Welcome to the Dialogue Architects, where we explore how enterprises can thoughtfully design, scale, and govern conversations between humans and machines. Today, we're joined by Alan Nichol, who's famously written on his LinkedIn bio, doing chatbots since before they were good, an engineering PhD, physicist turned co-founder and CTO of Rasa, and also my boss. Thanks for joining us today, Alan. Hey, Alan, welcome to the Dialogue Architects. Looking forward to having you on the show. Ultimately, it's also kind of an interesting scenario, conversation with your boss. Excited to interview you here today. This time you're in the hot seat, Alan.
Yeah,
and
wonderful.
I'd love in this section, maybe if we can kick it off, just let everyone know a little bit of an intro about yourself, why you're on this podcast today.
Yeah.
And in general, we're going to cover a lot about kind of the origin story of Rasa, maybe Alan himself as well.
Well, no, I'm excited that we're kicking off this project, and I saw the list of people that you have joining us on the pod, and I think I think people are going to like it. I think there's going to be a lot of good stuff.
The first question, I know you've been in the conversational AI space for many years, but did it really all begin in 2016, or did kind of your journey, to create Rasa start earlier? Kind of what about your background really led you into this space?
Yeah, it's a good question. Because was tinkering around with chatbot like things definitely before anything that started to look like Rasa. Maybe kind of going right the way back. So my background is in physics, and I was working on a PhD doing physics, but machine learning applied to physics. And I think this happens to a lot of people. You kind of fall in love with like the methods, and then maybe worry less about the application that you're building, and you get really excited about the kinds of things that you're able to build. So kind of fell down the rabbit hole of ML and all the things happening there, and natural language, and was working on a search engine. So I was building a search, like I guess you would call it now, sort of a prehistoric version of Glean, sort of enterprise search, RAG without the G, right?
Like without the G, that's a good way to put it.
And
just raw.
Just raw, yeah, exactly. And also this was before GDPR, so we could do all sorts of you can make these things simpler in many different ways, but let's not really go into all that.
Just violate all the privacy.
Yeah, exactly. Well, no, because we built like a personal search engine, right? So it would search all of your stuff, and it was like a browser extension, and it would look like the little spotlight search that you have on the Mac, and you could search across like all of your stuff, like your Dropbox and your Google Drive, and like the different apps you use for work, and you could find anything across all these places. And that I think was the sort of the starting point for getting interested in natural language, and how do you understand what people are asking for, and how do you go beyond just looking for keywords, and how do you really try and understand and have a conversation with people. So I think that was the sort of nexus of it. And then I would say another big factor in the whole thing was Slack as this app that, because we thought that search was going to be the thing that pulled everything together, right? We thought that's going to be the sort of universal entry point for work. And then Slack kind of came out, and it was this very exciting thing. And then like everything was going to be connected to it, and all your apps were going to like publish information into it, and you would like trigger things from Slack and all this stuff. And it kind of felt like, oh, that's actually the place you want to have as a sort of central command. And then you could build bots for Slack, and that was a very exciting thing, right? And that was sort of like 2015, something like that. You could build these little apps, and we built like silly ones, like based on cartoon characters, and we built like serious ones that were useful and interesting. But it was just this sort of very exciting thing, right? It was something in some ways like so much more lightweight than building a mobile app or building a website. In other ways, so much harder. Right, but
conversational interfaces 101. Yeah,
the interaction model is so much more complicated. But we were building a bunch of these things, and one of the ones that I like to talk about was we had built a chatbot for marketing teams, and they could talk to their marketing data. So you could ask questions like, how much are we spending on Facebook campaigns, and you would get a graph or a table. And it was sort of English to SQL was what we were doing in the background. And we had some teams that were paying for this, right? With some folks working. You could ask these really sophisticated questions. You could say things like, what was the ROI on all my campaigns by country for the last 3 weeks? and we would like, like we very quickly found out like
Been through it.
nobody talks like that. Like nobody thinks like that. If people thought like that, they would just write SQL themselves. So people would talk to this thing and they would go, "How's Facebook?" Right? Or how's Germany looking? And then you realize you got to have a sort of real conversation with people to understand what it is that they want, and they would have follow-up questions, and they would want to do deep dives and all this interesting stuff. So we kind of discovered this interesting set of problems of, well, how do you have like a true multi-turn conversation with people? And I mean, it was new to us. It's not like it was a new problem. And that was also the great irony of it, was when we started looking into it, we said, what's there for, what were the tools there for developers to build these things? And it was all like very rudimentary, right? There were 100 APIs and 100 frameworks all there for building Hello World. And there wasn't something that was, okay, you've done Hello World and now you want to do it for real, right? And this is the framework you want to use now that you know what you're doing. We said, like, surely we should build that. And surely there's some good ideas out there that, people have thought about this problem. And the great irony is that, like, in the old department where I had done my PhD, in the floor above where I'd been sitting was this like research group on dialogue systems that I never knew existed at the time, never knew those people or the work that they were doing, but they had, done decades of work on spoken dialogue systems, which was sort of, anyway, very different set of techniques to what we use today, even very different set of techniques to how we do things at Rasa, but was that sort of initial, hey, actually, there's lots of ideas here about how to do this in a better way, but there's nothing packaged in a way that actually sort of like developers are going to use it, right? It's all sort of code for other researchers. So it's interesting because search led me into chat, and now chat is search again because everyone does RAG. So, you never escape the same set of problems. You just keep doing the same thing over and over.
I guess if you add "me" at the end, it'll just be rage. You see it. I don't know how much longer it keeps going back and forth, but nonetheless, I think that's also maybe I met Rasa later on than, because I think you all kicked off in 2016, and then I met Rasa in 2021. But I remember one of the things that kind of resonated with me at that moment was this concept of trying to create a foundational or default framework for conversational AI. And I think that's something that Rasa kind of went after in a way that other folks hadn't done yet, is kind of say like, hey, we're all doing this lots of different ways. How can we find common ground or like a default framework to make this all hang together? So I think that was useful.
Naively, but that was how the thing started as well, was before we had any inkling of what Rasa should be, or like that there was going to be a product there, or that there was even going to be a company there. We were running a meetup, and we had a meetup for chatbot developers called Bots Berlin. And, there was just lots of enthusiasm about the topic, mostly because Facebook Messenger had launched as a platform. So it was like Slack, but with 1.5 billion consumers that you can build apps for and try and monetize. And, there was all this like hype and excitement, and all these folks were saying, yeah, okay, well, right now we're using, and this is also a funny parallel. Everyone said, right now we're using Google's NLP API, or there was one that had been bought by Facebook, and there was one that Microsoft was offering that they'd built in-house. And sort of like, well, I am entirely dependent on this third-party service for like every interaction with my app, right? I don't know anything about what the users are doing until this NLP API that I'm calling is telling me what the user's saying and doing. And that's a sort of precarious situation to be in, because I'm trying to build a business here, and I don't know how long these things are going to be free or when they're going to start charging me for it. And I'm sending all this data to other people, and I'm just like, it's a complete bottleneck. And I'd love to be independent of that. And so everyone kept telling us, oh, we're going to do our own NLP. And like, we don't have time for it now, but like next month we'll totally get around to it, kind of thing. And that kept happening. And it was all for pretty consistent reasons of sort of, owning such a critical part of your stack. And we said, okay, well, we've been building some stuff. We have a decent NLP engine, or NLU engine, I guess we called it. Like, why don't we just open source ours, and people can contribute to that rather than everybody, trying and failing to roll their own. A perfectly naive thought, but it was just like, it was just the right product at the right time. It was sort of that, it had been long enough that everyone was fed up with depending on these APIs. And it was just an open source package. It was like, here's a drop-in replacement for whatever you're using today. and you can run it yourself and you can migrate within like a couple of hours. We'd really made it easy to, ingest the data, and the API was compatible and everything else. But it's also funny that, now everyone's building all these apps that are totally dependent on like a third-party API for like core function. And no one even questions that anymore, right? It's just sort of, well,
of course.
that's it, right? I mean, AWS went down last week. What's it like when AI goes down or Anthropic goes down or something?
Or
like
both
that,
at the same
right?
time. Goodness.
Yeah.
The world would stop.
Yeah.
I guess maybe then I'd love to look in there. Well, first, I think with the NLP pipeline that you were kind of talking about there, that might well be the longest lived part of the Rasa platform. Is that possible? I think because in some way or another, it's still evident today, and we'll talk more
100%.
about that later. Kind of the future of intents, manifestations, things that you've called out that came to light, what may come to light in the future, but.
Right.
Nonetheless, I think that's probably cool. If I were to look at the entire Rasa stack, I feel like that's the longest lived piece of it.
It's definitely the longest lived piece of it. It was really the sort of that initial piece and that initial prototype, and I just can't even remember. I can't even describe to you how janky it was, but it was just so very, very simple. It was like, hey, we can do text classification in a very, very simple way. And of course, this was pre-BERT. I mean, this was certainly pre-transformer, and this was the big exciting thing we were all hyped about was called word to vec, and it was like, hey, you can do maths with words now, right? And you can represent words in this interesting way, and you can do you can build a simple classifier on top of that. And but I think that's it's a very, very consistent part of the product in terms of how you feed data into it and what the API looks like. It's been definitely the longest lived part. I mean, the components that go into it, plug and play, the Lego bricks, people have had different choices over the years, and we've introduced new models and things like that. But that core concept has been really pretty remarkably stable.
And then I remember you were mentioning earlier in our conversation that, when you were first starting, you were kicking around with Slack bots and kind of trying different things. I'm curious just because I miss this kind of like golden early startup age. The Berlin office is thriving. It's there. What was that like? Is there any good stories you have for some of us older, let's say, or later Rasas, not necessarily older, of I don't know, interesting stuff that you built, stuff that worked, didn't work, funny stuff? Because I feel like especially in early startups, you have like a bunch of really clever, but also very creative, 20 somethings, 30 somethings building things, which I think always is exciting.
Definitely. And I mean, we were very, very scrappy as you would want to be, right? And like very, very frugal. And, the nice thing about that ethos, especially if you're an early stage company that's open source, you can really punch above your weight and you can really be a thorn in the side of so much bigger companies, right? And I think that was sort of something that drew us all into it and made us all very excited about it. It was like when we would like dislodge one of these enormous players from some large enterprise account because they were just, all in on it. And something that I think was really special from the early days of Rasa was we bet on some people who on paper you would not hire to do a specific job, but just because we were never the kind to think about like years of experience as the thing that we cared about. It was purely what's our judgment, can this person do this job? And I think we took a bet on some really bright people who did a fantastic job and also had tremendous career growth and like went on after Rasa and did other incredible things. But we hired a lot of people into roles that had like never done that role before, or some of us had never even had a job before, right? We're just sort of fresh out of university or something like that. But I think we hired some really great people and did some great things. And it was always through that that lens of everyone else is telling you that this is easy, and and Ross is like actually here for when you've done that and you've realized that it's not so easy and maybe you want to do it properly, right? And I think there's just a lot of appetite and a lot of, especially at the time, like a lot of overpromise of what conversational AI could do, and that sort of clashing with the reality of what people were able to achieve realistically. And a thing that I think is really special about those early days of Rasa was that I used to describe it as quite a porous company because the big Rasa champions at our biggest customers and our, people who were looking at Rasa and maybe potentially going to become customers, they knew the code base, they knew the product, they were contributing to the code base, they were as expert in Rasa as almost anyone who worked at Rasa. And at the same time, our, customer facing teams, our support teams were so deeply embedded and so knowledgeable about the projects, and so sort of on, intimate first name terms with all these people that they were building together with, that it didn't always feel like there was even a clear line of like who's actually officially in the company and who's out, right? It always felt like kind of this continuum, and we had such a like large community that we were building that also felt like part of the community, right? And some of those folks end up joining Rasa, and some of those folks are still at Rasa.
Yeah, I think that was actually one of my questions I had for later. But at the end of the day, I think at Rasa we talk a lot about building and designing for kind of high trust conversations. But I think it's also trickles down in the sense because working at Rasa, I feel like also a lot of my colleagues are incredibly, have a lot of integrity and are high trust in that sense as well. So I think it's part of the company culture that I really like about working at Rasa. And what do you think? Does it come from that alone, or how did you manage to keep that going over so many years? Because I come from the Bay Area. I've worked with Bay Area tech. It's a much different vibe than it is in, this just incredibly transparent and humble, I would say, kind of culture that we have here.
Yeah. It's a good observation. I think it's maybe one of those things where it's there at the seed and then it becomes self-reinforcing. And I mean, of course, starting as an open source product, right? And we also had a rule, no brains on the website, right? That was, that was really hard.
Never any brains on the website.
We had that conversation when we were kind of thinking about our identity as a company, as an early company. And, something that loomed large in my mind at the time was this DeepMind acquisition, which was like, wow, huge acquisition, incredible, like what a company. And we thought, like, should we try and be like the DeepMind of conversational AI and just be a deep research company, and product will come later and we'll just do lots of R&D and who knows. So you kind of have these sort of forks in the road where you can choose an identity, right? And I think ultimately you choose what comes naturally to you. And for us, it just felt right because there was so much fluff, and I mean there's a lot of AI fluff now, but like at least AI works a lot better, so
that's true.
You can get away with that, right? And you had
the gap between the fluff and the claim is
a lot less than it was, right? And people would say, oh, this is like, and I mean that was, I think, for me a big motivation for starting the company in the first place was there was all this talk about conversational AI is going to revolutionize X, Y, and Z, and then I was like, all right, how are you building these things? Well, first we have a classifier, and then we have a bunch of if statements saying like what to do. And I thought, well, that doesn't sound like transformative technology to me. That sounds like, the same way you would have built this 20, 30 years ago. So what's really new here? I think it kind of came out of that early ethos of building something that was loved by the people working on it, right? And building something that people could identify with. And that was certainly an early goal, was that people who work with Rasa aren't just users, but they think of themselves like, I'm a Rasa developer, I'm a Rasa user, right? That the people would put that on their CV and they would think of themselves that way, because it's, obviously an important piece of, I guess, like loyalty or affinity or just being a true champion of a product.
I even notice that sometimes on LinkedIn, when I go and search for, people who work at Rasa, I'll notice there's a bunch of people from other company who have like Rasa, even sometimes like on their resume, on their LinkedIn, like they work there, Rasa developer. I mean, yes, technically, yes, you are. I mean,
it's cool. Great. I was very encouraging of it, right?
Yeah. I think part of this also has come from you've had a lot of early on big bets that kind of have also panned out in reality. And one of which is I think the article you wrote was something, and Tensor House of Cards, things like that. I'd love to dive in a little bit there, because while the classifier, the Rasa classifier, NLP classifier is something that still exists in our product today, is like the cornerstone of early research.
Yeah.
At the same time, even from the beginning, you were like, hey, I think this is only short term. There's going to be something that comes after. What made you have such conviction?
A direction that we pursued, which was a kind of a dead end, and we pursued it for quite a few years. So the literature was pointing in that direction, was kind of live in this world where you accept that the way you understand users is just like this classification thing, right? You predefine these categories, right? You have the person greeting you, or they're saying thank you, or they're asking for, an account upgrade, or they want to cancel, or whatever, right? These predefined categories, and the job of like understanding a user is just to pick one of those. And the idea is, okay, accept that as a fact, and then try and build like a very clever dialogue manager that can, handle the fact that actually, that's not how conversations really work. Like, people don't think of a category and then come up with a way to express it. They just, say what they want. And I remember, working on that problem for many years, and we published some papers on it and all that kind of stuff. How do you build like a more clever dialogue manager? And kind of coming to the realization over time that actually what people wanted was a very simple dialogue manager, and like an oracle, like a perfect like understanding component that could just make sense of any of the complexity of anything that like people were asking for. And that's obviously a lot closer to what we have now. Mm-hmm. But when you're working on a project and you are trying to iterate and improve how something works over time, in this sort of classification paradigm, you're building a supervised model that is classifying what users are saying into some buckets. And the thing you have at your disposal to improve that is to like improve the training data that's fed into that classifier. And so you're looking at conversations that people are having, and you're saying, okay, what went wrong here? Could I fix this problem by improving my classifier? And you realize that actually the fraction of conversations that didn't go well that you could fix by having like a smarter classifier, it's actually very, very small. And what you see when you're looking at it is that there's just often this mismatch between the way that you organize the world as a large company building a support agent and the way that your customers think about the world. And we used to think of this as sort of disambiguation, right? And a person comes in and says, you messed up my order. And you go, okay, well, we've got to do some disambiguation, right? Like, we don't know what is up with the order and how we're going to help. But it's not just like, it's not ambiguous. What the person said is perfectly clear. It's just in their reality, and it doesn't obey your divisions and all this stuff. So I feel as though that idea of like intent and forcing everything into a classification was just that very concrete manifestation of that mismatch. And it just became very obvious very quickly that so long as we live with that assumption that we always have to classify messages into these predefined buckets, we're never going to make meaningful progress, because that's really the sort of the bottleneck, right? And then you try and fix something, and because the thing that happens after that classification is all these if statements, right? Then if you introduce a new category, then okay, well, what else is going to go in that category? And what if people say that in the middle of the conversation? And what if they say that like then? And then, you have this plate of spaghetti that represents your business logic on the back end of that classification. And that just felt so brittle and so obviously the wrong way to do it. And just such a mismatch for how language understanding works. I mean, I used to joke, I said, it's fine that we call it natural language understanding so long as you remember that it's a lie and the computer doesn't understand anything, right? Like, it's just we're assigning things that users said to some predefined buckets. I think what model 2 today is a lot closer to understanding.
True. I think that always was hard for me to explain to people that were new in conversational AI projects, was like, what is the confidence ranking? And 80%, that must be really good. And I sit there and think, I guess it depends, because it was so arbitrary between different vendors, Roz as well. It was all relative to whatever you were doing in your little bubble, which I think is nice today. It's not.
And that's a nice shift that we have now, where, okay, we used to always work in this supervised learning paradigm where you would take some data, you would annotate it, and then you would train a model to like do that classification, or typically classification. And you would have these sort of confidence values and everything, and you would get all these sort of misconceptions. People would think that if now I retrain my model and it's now reporting higher confidence values. That means I have a better model, right? Like all sorts of issues with how people actually operationally worked with supervised learning. But the way we work now with LLMs, where you just type in English like what it is you would like to have happen, is actually a lot closer to, I think, the way that people want to work with ML and with AI. Because what we saw was that people would have those heuristics in their head of what they wanted to happen, and they would kind of launder it through some data generation process and then force the model to learn what it was that they think the model should learn. So in some ways it's more honest. The sort of prompt and pray thing that we do now is a bit more honest of like what we're actually trying to achieve.
I think maybe I'll give my, like, one of the things that I sometimes am frustrated with in this space today is that everyone assumes that everything should be a conversational interface, like just everything, like your TV, your fridge, your water, kettle, like, and sometimes I struggle with this idea of like, okay, what makes a good application? What makes a good conversational interface? That's my soapbox. One day maybe I'll get off of it, but nonetheless,
I like it.
I'd love to hear from your side, like, what are some of the things, like the new sins of this era that you're seeing pop up?
Honestly, I think feeding the output of an LLM back into an LLM or back into another LLM is a mortal sin. Okay. And that's a slight exaggeration, but it's not that much of an exaggeration. I think, the idea that we're just going to call an LLM multiple times in series and just feed its output back into itself. I mean, there are times when it's appropriate and there are times when it works, but it's just such a bananas way to engineer a system, right? You have all this unpredictability that on the output side of an LLM, and now you're like multiplying it, right? You're plugging an amplifier into another amplifier into another amplifier, and you have this like horrible feedback loop. And now, so at some point, some noise gets introduced, and you're like, which noise caused which thing to sort of diverge in some crazy direction. So I think that there's a time and a place for it, but generally speaking, I think it's something to be avoided at all costs unless there's really a good reason why you should be doing that. So can you do things in one shot? I mean, the other is, and if you go on sort of Reddit and things like that, and you check out sort of developer forums, and you look at like people asking questions like, how do I do X? How do I do Y? How do I do Z? Things that are, people are really scratching their heads, how do I solve this problem? They're only a difficult problem because you're starting with the assumption that everything goes through an LLM and and you can only work in this paradigm. This is the only way you can do things, right? And you're like, that's actually a very simple and a very well solved problem. But you're just coming at it in a silly way, sort of narrow things down a little bit. So there are plenty of sins, but I think that would probably be the main one.
Well, I guess we've covered maybe so far cardinal sins. So continually using an LLM for things it shouldn't be used as. Brains on the website, absolutely no go. But what are some of the things you're kind of more excited about or more hopeful?
So I mean, I think that AI assisted coding is, I mean, this is a cold take. I mean, everybody thinks this, but it's just amazing. It's just truly, truly amazing. The thing, in terms of someone who builds products, the thing that it really unlocks that I never thought was possible is that I can interact with Claude Code and be building a project and describe what I want at any level of abstraction that I like and that makes sense to me at any given point in time. And I sometimes talk about Rasa as a 10-year quest to find the right abstractions, right? Like, what are the right Lego bricks? What are the things you really need to compose together to build good conversational AI? And that's always something we're talking about internally, right? Is this the right abstraction? Can we move it up? Can we move it down? Can we reuse this? Can we merge these things? And the original sort of coining of the term vibe coding was around sort of just talking at a high level, like looking at a UI that's being built for you, just describing the change you want, not even looking at the code that's being generated, and working at that level of abstraction and all the way down to being very, very specific about the specific change that you want to make. And so there's all the productivity gains and all this kind of stuff from AI assisted coding, but I think that ability to work on different levels of abstraction as someone who builds products, to me is just kind of mind blowing.
Yeah.
So that's something I'm very bullish on and very excited about.
I think for me too, in that direction, one of the things I'm excited about is the element of validation in that you get when you're working with something new. Because I think of my own journey, learning some code here and there.
Yeah.
One of the biggest issues you have always is that you can't scan a project and be like, oh, that looks wrong, because you don't have the knowledge or the skill yet.
Right.
But to have something actually tell you, oh, you messed up here, and go through that learning cycle, I think that's super useful and expedites the process. Maybe for the worse, because I'm not sure yet, because I didn't go through that process of figuring out where I messed up. I just had someone serve it to me on a platter.
Yeah.
A thing. So I think
anthropomorphizing, is that one of the deadly sins as well?
That's a deadly sin, up there with brains. Don't anthropomorphize machines.
Yeah.
Put that up there. No, that makes loads of sense. So in general, just kind of vibe coding, being able to iterate, build quickly.
Yeah. I mean, I heard it described as I think it was Sam Altman. He said it's like the fast fashion era of software, which, you can have ethical qualms about fast fashion, which are totally valid, but from a software perspective, sort of on demand, software, and being able to interact with things just in a way that makes sense to you. To your point, whether you're knowledgeable about the technology, but you're totally new to a project, right? And you're just like onboarding to a new code base or a new project or something like that, and you can just be effective right away, right?
Yeah. Although you were mentioning about abstractions, and I think maybe this is when I think about the future of conversational interfaces, one of my concerns is actually now the exponential, let's say, sprawl of abstractions. I feel like when I think about all of the different ways that you can manage dialogue today, we have a session coming up here at Rasa, and we introduced some new things, and I'm like, goodness, I mean, even someone who's deep in this field, it's hard to look at all of your options and understand what will make sense.
Yeah, no, you're right. And I would say 2018 through 2023 were 5 years that I was very deeply frustrated at the lack of appetite for new ideas in conversational AI, especially in enterprises. And, we were sort of pushing a lot of stuff and coming up with new ideas and different approaches and things. And everyone was pretty dead set on, well, no, this is how it works, right? Like we have our NLU and then we have a bunch of if statements, and that's just how things go. And sort of be careful what you wish for, because now there's just such an explosion of new ideas, and we're really in an exploration phase, right? And you see that with, every team that we talk to, that you and I talk to, is working with the assumption that we're building something now, but it needs to be flexible enough that, because we're assuming that in 12 months time we're going to want to change how this thing works because some new underlying capability has been unlocked, right? Or just the models have gotten smarter or cheaper or whatever, or something else has changed about it. So I think it's still very much a moving target, and everyone's trying to, of course, plant a flag and say, like, this is the thing and this is the right way to do it. But it's moving too quickly in too many different directions, I think.
Yeah. And I guess when you think about like new skills or mindsets that people need to adopt, and I'm always like trying to, I think especially when you live through the past of conversational AI, it's hard to think beyond, because you're so used to what works, skeptical about what doesn't work.
Yeah.
But what are those skills and mindsets that people need to switch?
Yeah, I would say currently, there are kind of, they're just two completely different worlds. There are people who worked on conversational AI before ChatGPT, and there's someone who came to it afterwards, and they just have very, very different understandings of the universe, and just think about a very different set of things and ask different questions and use different vocabulary and just have different starting assumptions. And something I've been feeling in the last 3-4 months or so is that it's not that hallucinations have been solved, but people got bored of talking about them. So it's just less of a topic now. Just the attention span of the hype cycle to focus on something, right? So it's definitely still a problem. It's
Yeah.
definitely still a thing, but you just hear less about it because it's like, well, maybe it's just the cost of doing business, or maybe it's just, but either way, it's just not, people kind of got bored of it and moved on to talk about different topics. So you kind of have things moving at very different cadences. You have the hype cycle, and then you have sort of consolidation of technology abstractions and things that are actually working and are actually being used, right? And often the thing that's most talked about is still very, very premature and still very very experimental. But I will say it's very exciting to have so many more brains thinking about this problem now than we did 5-6 years ago, right? That's pretty exciting. And like all this stuff
Yeah.
works so much better. Like if you had something like what we can build today in a few minutes time, and you could show that 5 years ago, it would have absolutely blown people's minds, right? So everything that people were promising in the past is hypothetically possible. The other thing I think about is so many things change, but what doesn't change? And that there I'm just shamelessly ripping off Jeff Bezos and that, but I think it's a really important question to ask yourself, and it's helpful for us at Rasa, which is, well, people need infrastructure that evolves with them, and we've rebuilt Rasa completely many times over the lifetime of the company, and sort of reinvented the engine quite a few times. And some abstractions stay and stick around, and some you get to deprecate and get to invent new ones and build new things. The teams that we support are heterogeneous and complex and built for a large complex set of use cases and millions of end customers, whether that's on the phone or via chat or whatever it might be. So, and you can derive some constraints from that, just from the organization that's trying to deliver something, right? So while there is lots of change of like what's trendy, I think a lot of the core principles are actually remarkably solid.
Oh, that's so true. I think even as you were saying earlier, like the promise finally fulfilled. I realized recently that I changed how I introduce what I do at like a barbecue. If someone were to ask me, in the past, I almost started with an apology, like, yeah, I work at a company and we build those little things at the bottom of the screen that are annoying and pop up, and but they're getting better. We're working on it. We're trying to make it better. And now it's like agentic AI. Like, you just throw it in there.
Well, okay, so we have an onboarding meeting that I run for anyone who joins Rasa, and we do a little round of introductions, and we ask a couple of questions about yourself. And one of the questions is, what's your favorite AI agent? And for most of the age of the company, people really struggled to come up with something that they had used and they had enjoyed, and and now of course everybody has 5 or 6 that they've encountered recently that were quite good, that they're using personally for their own experience, right? So it's obviously a very remarkable shift.
Yeah, really cool space to be in. I think as we wrap up today, 2 final questions. If you could give one piece of advice to kind of an enterprise that is, let's say, maybe just starting their journey today, what would it be?
I mean, it's a good question. Are there any enterprises who are just starting their journey today? I feel like,
yeah, definitely. They're starting, like, I guess maybe this is it. Here, I'll give you mine first. I would say, like, don't think that RAG alone is your only option. That would be my advice, because I think when people like, and I'm even like small, large companies, when they start dabbling, I'm seeing like so many just Q&A bots. And I guess I want to say, like, you can do so much more. You can actually solve problems in chat. It doesn't have to be. And I know that's like kind of the first foot in the door, so it makes sense to maybe do first. But that would be my advice, is like, think beyond that.
Yeah.
But fair point. What would you give then to someone who's been, let's say, a tried and tested, battle scarred conversational enterprise? What's your advice today then?
I mean, I think the thrust of it's got to be to stay focused on actual user problems that you're trying to solve, and not checking boxes that you integrated, like the latest 3-letter acronym or the latest model or whatever else it might be, because there's a lot of fluff and a lot of hype and a lot of things that aren't real. And the only thing that you really be judged on at the end of the day is how happy are you making customers. And whatever technology you're using, don't sleep on the value of just looking at some of the conversations that real end users are having with your system, and developing your own intuition and judgment about how good of an experience that is, where it could be better, what the opportunities are, what else could be. Because instant gratification, it's easier than ever to build a sort of semi vaporware kind of very cool demo, but it's still very difficult to really move a business number, right? Move a metric that people care about.
I think that rounds out top 3 cardinal sins at Rasa. Brains on the website,
Right.
anthropomorphizing machines,
Yeah.
and 3-letter acronym standing for vaporware. That could be like the top 3.
Very good.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Alan. Finally, how can listeners really stay connected with your work and kind of keep in touch with Rasa? Give you feedback if they ever give our product a try. I can definitely recommend anyone who's listening in go and try out Hello Rasa. We can maybe link it in the description and give it a go. Learn how Rasa works.
Yeah, no, I mean, you beat me to it, but we have a nice new experience for getting started with Rasa, and that's feedback we've had consistently over many years, is that Rasa is very powerful, but it's maybe a little intimidating if you haven't used it before. And we built a very nice experience that doesn't require any upfront Rasa knowledge, that lets you build something very cool in a very short amount of time, and immediately see how Rasa agents are very explainable and understandable and composable, and help you build that confidence in how the system works and what you've built and how you can scale from there.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Alan. Till the
All
next
right.
time.
Thanks for having me on, Lauren.